I think we are seeing generally in our culture what some psychologists have described as a meaning crisis. And there is this void, I think, in people's lives.
Welcome back to For All the Saints podcast, and I've got Justin Brierley here today with me. Justin, thank you so much for coming on the show. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for inviting me on. Great to be here.
Thank you. I actually wanted to start by asking you about your own personal faith. I'm quite interested in how you became a Christian, and are there any defining moments in your spiritual life?
Yeah, quite a few probably. But I was raised in a Christian family. But like so many people, I think, had to make that my own at some point. And that happened in my sort of mid-teenage years. And it was very much a sort of an experiential thing. I was actually raised in a fairly charismatic evangelical church. And so sort of having quite a sort of full-on emotional kind of response to the gospel was not necessarily unusual. But I kind of, it was at a retreat weekend that I went on with my youth group from the church that it all came alive for me, really. And I would say I had a moment where, the pieces fell together, and I found that this made sense, that I wanted to pursue this, and something came alive in me, really. But I would say that was only the start. There was still a long way to go in terms of my faith deepening and maturing in various ways, because a few years later I went off to university, Oxford University, and, quickly met a lot of skepticism and encountered a lot of people who didn't share my faith. So I think that was when I probably started to really discover things like apologetics and theology and ways of putting across faith to others that hadn't had my experience, And there were certainly, plenty of doubts that came along the way, but it was a good time, I think, to sort of to engage that, and set me up quite well, actually, both in terms of what I was studying and the experiences I was having, in terms of engaging people, not only atheists there, but also Christians of other traditions and things, to kind of what I then went on to do, which was to host conversations between Christians and atheists, and also Christians of different perspectives on The Unbelievable show in my kind of adult working career. But that was kind of where it began for me, a sort of personal experience, but having to sort of work that out in the real world as I started to put, how faith works in real life with skeptics around me and that kind of thing.
How do you ensure when you're well versed in the most well-known atheists in the world, and have met and debated with some, and have written about them in your most recent book? How do you make sure that you do have a strong enough foundation? Do you think there is an important obligation for us to have the sort of academic understanding of it, as well as just sort of building personal faith to a point where it's not shaky?
I think it is going to be different for different people depending on how they're wired. I think for those who are just wired in that way where they kind of question things more, then they're going to need, something more in terms of an intellectual foundation than perhaps for those for whom, faith just comes at a very natural, experiential, spiritual level, and they don't necessarily seem to need that. So it's going to vary. But, I suppose I go back to, that command in Scripture that we're to love God with all our strength, heart, and mind, and there's that sense in which sometimes the mind has been relegated and it's all been about experience and the heart and the feelings, but actually we're told to love God with our mind, and for me that's about understanding, digging into the intellectual treasures that are there in the Christian faith, and so for me, I just know that for many people that will be part of their worship, is coming to understand God in that way and to dig in. It shouldn't sort of, in a way, become an idol, as anything can become an idol. Simply understanding God in purely intellectual terms can, I think, actually, some people can start to lean on that too much, as though that's the answer to everything. Ultimately, there is a great mystery in faith, and we are called to pray and to, do things in God's strength rather than in our own intellectual ability. But having said all that, I think God's given us a mind because he wants us to understand the world and understand him using it. So for me, that's been both a challenge and a joy, because obviously there are challenges when it comes to intellectually engaging with the Christian faith, especially when you're putting yourself in the firing line with conversations with skeptics on a regular basis. But at the same time, it's been a great joy, because I've come out of that feeling, actually, no, this makes sense as a worldview. It's not that I'm saying, it's all about me understanding the Kalam cosmological argument or anything like that. But in the end, I do find that this makes compelling intellectual sense to me, as well as making emotional sense to me, the Christian faith.
Mm-hmm. You, something that I greatly admire and respect about you is just your unashamed being open about Christianity. I almost think a lot of Christians feel like they can't talk about it, or they can't be open about it. I mean, do you have any advice for people like that about speaking about God, making his name known, sharing the good news?
As I said earlier, I think it is often about our personality, and God will use us in different ways. I think the problem sometimes is when people are taught one particular way of doing it as though that's the right way for everyone, and it's simply not. There are extroverts and there are introverts, and I think God can use them both in their own way to share the good news. But you're unlikely to find the introverts kind of walking up to people on the streets, and but you might find that the introvert is a great person for writing a book and sharing things in that way, who can have a different kind of conversation with someone. So it's evangelism in the end is, I think you need to find your style, and there will be a sphere of influence that you can reach. And again, you don't need to be some heavyweight apologist by any means to be able to be a good evangelist. I think we need evangelists in every area of life, and frankly, there are some people who don't have a degree or secondary education or anything really, who are going to do a far better job where they are evangelizing the folk around them than I could ever do in that situation. So it really is about playing to your strengths and just asking God to use you in the way that you've been made in that way.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. I like that. But onto your book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. It's a brilliant book, and the podcast. I've been digesting the podcast like mad. I really want people watching this and listening this to get the book. I've been listening on Spotify audiobook version, and it's brilliant. I suppose my first question is, you spoke to so many people making it, and there are a lot of quite well-known figureheads of different movements that are mentioned in it. What have some of your favorite experiences of the writing process been for that book?
Yeah, the writing process is so different in a way to what I normally am doing, which is interviewing and creating shows and podcasts and that kind of thing. Because in a way, when you're doing that, you're just obviously engaging the person in front of you and the topic that you're discussing, and you don't necessarily pause and kind of take a big long look back at how things have evolved. But that's what I did with this book. It was much it was taking a step back and saying, well, I've hosted conversations with Christians and skeptics week in and week out, but what's been the shape of those conversations over the last several years? And in that way, the book was kind of me trying to sort of, I suppose, almost resolve for myself more than anyone the way in which I think the conversation on faith has changed quite significantly in the last decade or so. Because I started, hosting conversations on The Unbelievable Show in the mid-2000s, around the time New Atheism was really starting to get going. But as I say in the book, I think the New Atheism kind of had this momentous rise, but also this quite dramatic fall. And so a lot of the conversations I focus on in the book are actually conversations from more recent years, where I'm seeing a lot more secular intellectuals who are taking Christianity seriously, not dismissing it in the way that the new atheists like Dawkins and Harris and Hitchens did. So some of those are perhaps sort of my favorite sort of moments that I was able to kind of glean some real gems out of, in the writing of the book. Interesting moments in some of those conversations with people who aren't necessarily Christians, but who are taking faith seriously again. And that's kind of a lot of where the material is kind of showing why I think these people are starting to take Christianity seriously again.
Was it primarily new atheism that caused the initial decline that sort of showed us that it needed a rebirth, or were there other things going on in society? I mean, is it possible to pinpoint?
New atheism, sort of, you mean as for the decline of Christianity in our culture?
Yeah, sort of why it needed a rebirth in the first place. Where did it start going downhill?
Well, I think in many ways, new atheism was just the cherry on top of a long process of secularization in the West. So long before the God delusion got written, you'd had declining church attendance in the UK. You'd had, increasingly people not describing themselves as religious and so on. I mean, you could trace that probably right back to, I don't know, the Reformation or the Enlightenment or something. There's been a kind of gradual kind of secularization of the West. I mean, I start the book with a poem by the Victorian poet Matthew Arnold, Dover Beach, which has this oft-quoted line about the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. And that was 150 years ago that Arnold was seeing the tide of faith going out in his generation, or, so it's only accelerated since. So in many ways, Dawkins and co were kind of just a far more dogmatic, sort of in-your-face version of what had sort of been going on as an undercurrent for a long time anyway. So I don't think they caused the death of Christianity. Christianity in the West has been kind of undergoing a long, slow sort of death for quite some time. What's interesting, I think, though, is that sometimes that expression of atheism, because it kind of revealed, in a sense, the logic of atheism, the fact that these are people who do believe we live in a meaningless universe, in a clockwork universe, in a completely deterministic universe. I think in a way you have to get to that point for people to start thinking, well, does this worldview make sense? And I just think that we're starting to see, as I describe in the book, this turning of the tide. Matthew Arnold's Sea of Faith perhaps is just starting to come back in again, because I'm seeing surprising indications of the ways in which we, the new atheism firstly failed, sort of died a death, but also the way that, as I say, many of these secular thinkers are starting to reevaluate Christian faith, and just lots of surprising stories of people who are coming to faith. Now, that doesn't mean that there's a tidal wave, coming back in, but I do feel like something shifted in the atmosphere. And to that extent, I think that's symptomatic of generally of Christianity. It always kind of has gone in cycles or tides. There have been various deaths and rebirths of the church over the centuries, and I think we kind of might be in for one just at the moment.
Are you seeing like societal trends showing that the water's getting to the end of the row in terms of, I don't know, behavioral changes and stuff from this beginning of rebirth?
So the metaphor I use is kind of the tide may be kind of reaching its furthest limit before it comes back in again, because I think we are seeing generally in our culture what some psychologists have described as a meaning crisis in our culture. And I think that's tied to the fact that we live in this very post-Christian West, where essentially, as many historians like Tom Holland have been pointing out, actually all our basic assumptions about value and democracy and human rights and equality and freedom are still fundamentally Christian at their core. It's just we've forgotten the story that actually birthed all of that. But as I think we kind of have lost sight of that Christian story, which once gave a sense of meaning and purpose and identity to people, I think we have seen this meaning crisis come about, because people become unmoored from each other, from the communities that once sustained them, and from ultimately a kind of transcendent source of value and meaning in God. And then they try to fill it with something, because, nature abhors a vacuum, and there is this void, I think, in people's lives. And I think it's being filled, actually, ironically, by other quasi forms of religion. And, again, many of the secular intellectuals I'm speaking to have been pointing this out. People like Douglas Murray and Jordan Peterson and others, saying, well, actually, it's these kind of, often it's the progressive, far left kind of ideologies, around sexuality and gender and everything else that kind of become sacred sort of objects and identities to people, kind of basically trying to fill the void, the God-shaped void. equally, you could point to, mythologies on the right, the cult of Trump or whatever, as a similar thing where people are trying to essentially make sense of life through a bigger narrative. But these are working for people, and that's why we've got the culture wars. It's why we're all become so tribal. And so my feeling overall is that this kind of meaning crisis is kind of priming the pump, if you like, for there to be this rebirth. And I think the reason I'm seeing a number of people turn back to Christianity, unlikely candidates, but who are coming through interesting avenues like Jordan Peterson's Bible lectures and things like that, is because they are, suddenly realizing I need something more. And, and maybe there is something in this ancient text and this ancient wisdom that could make sense for me. So that's kind of where I see, the bigger sort of social currents, if you like, suggesting that we might be starting to see this, us edging towards that turning of the tide in that way.
I think there's something surprising too, in that much of that rebirth could be argued to be fueled by the younger generations too. And that there was a great article, I can't remember where it was though, I think it was in The Spectator, but I can't remember. But essentially they were analysing a TikTok that was from a couple of weeks ago, and it had millions and millions of views and a lot of engagement. And it was basically a young girl saying, life is so hard, I'm turning to prayer. Like, life knocked me down so much that I actually started praying. And all of the comments were alike, I couldn't believe that I actually went to church because I'm struggling so much on Sunday. And many people saying that they're coming to church, primarily Gen Z. And so that question,
I'm noticing this as well. And I think it's interesting to me that, in a funny way, I think there is a generation, especially of the kind of, so before millennials, it was Gen X, right? So I think that the Gen X generation, which, to some extent, includes a lot of the new atheists, they were kind of inoculated against religion because they had just enough of it in the cultural kind of milieu that they were brought up in, that they think they know it, and like an inoculation, you just give someone just a little bit of the virus and it kind of inoculates them against the real thing. I think that's what a lot of people have had in our sort of nominally Christian culture. Now, I think once you get to Gen Z, you're looking at a completely unchurched generation, and so they haven't even got the residue of it. And in a funny way, I think that makes them more open to it because they no longer have an assumption of what it is actually, and there's just they don't necessarily have the baggage that comes, from a slightly older generation who think Christianity is just this, fuddy-duddy, strange, fusty old churches and rules, So I'm interested because I see that as well among Gen Z, interestingly, a kind of more of an openness. And funny enough, there's just been some research done just quite recently showing that there seems to be a little uptick in Gen Z kind of actually going to church and Christianity and that kind of thing, which you would not expect. You just expect everything to keep going like this across the generations. But it looks like, early readings at least, that might not be the case right now.
That's fantastic. And as well, sort of tying into that, we seem to have this, and you alluded to it, this identity crisis of the role of masculinity. What is it? Men have been called toxic for quite a while now. And the trends seem to show that is switching to females. And there were some studies showing that teenage girls are like the most depressed group of people in society right now. And I wonder, what does that say to you about tying into the rebirth of belief in God, about this identity crisis?
I think that's right. I think the meaning crisis I described earlier could just as easily be described as an identity crisis, because we are living in an age where essentially people are told you can be whatever you want to be. The rule book has been ripped up. And that's obviously put as a very positive thing, hey, you don't have to abide by anyone's predetermined rules, And in a sense, the Christian story did give you a kind of predetermined story to live in. And now people say, well, you know, you don't need to have a story. You can make your own story. You know, it's a kind of choose your own adventure kind of approach to life, where your identity and everything can be essentially molded in whatever way you like. The problem with that, I think, is that it creates an intolerable burden upon young people. And I don't think that's what a lot of the people who advocate for it realize, is it's incredibly difficult to bear the stress of basically creating your own identity from scratch. I don't think we're made to do that. I think we are made to live in a certain identity. And when we try to create another identity from scratch, it's just incredibly difficult to do and to bear. And it creates all these divisions in our culture as well, because if different people with so many different sort of claims on identity will end up banging up against each other in various ways, as we see with the, you know, the trans debates and everything else. So all of this kind of creates this sort of identity crisis as well, because I think it's true, yeah, as you say, of young men especially, they don't know who they are or what they're supposed to be. I think that's why, interestingly, figures like Peterson have been so popular, because they kind of, for a certain generation of young men, they've provided a sort of father figure, a wise sage, kind of just giving them permission almost to be masculine again in a funny way. I think there are better and worse examples of this. I mean, at the very really dangerous end of the spectrum, you have the Andrew Tates and so on, who have a very misogynistic vision of masculinity. And I abhor, you know, the thinking and actions, but I know why it's been so popular with a generation of young men. It's because they haven't been given a role model that kind of works for them, and so they will go in that direction if that's all they've got access to, and that's the most kind of compelling voice on their social media feed and so on. Jordan Peterson, I think, is a much better example of someone kind of advocating for a kind of a masculinity that is actually founded in true sacrifice and heroism and sort of the archetypes that he draws on, especially from the Bible. I don't say it's perfect by any means, but I think it's a heck of a lot better than the Andrew Tate version. But for me, you know, the archetype of humanity for both men and women is Jesus Christ, and for me, he both embraces his humanity and his maleness, while also subverting a lot of the stereotypes sometimes that we tend to, you know, and the cultural things that we tend to associate with it. And so I think what we need to do is point people back to a true model of, you know, if we're talking about young men, a true model of what real godly masculinity looks like. And I'm not going to point them necessarily to Jordan Peterson for that. I'm going to point them to Jesus Christ for that, and say it's here that you find, you know, life in all its fullness and what it means. I mean, it's interesting you say there's this divide, I think, between young girls and boys. I think actually the latest research shows that boys are also experiencing a lot of sort of social anxiety and so on. It's just the girls are leading that, you know, tend to be several points higher. But the general trend across all of Gen Z and young people is this kind of, huge rates of anxiety. Really sadly, suicide rates are the highest they've ever been among young men. All of this, you know, and we're supposed to be living, aren't we, in this kind of super technological age, highly advanced. We have got more material prosperity than we've ever had in any generation before, and yet we don't seem to be able to save ourselves. We don't seem to be able to medicate ourselves or philosophize ourselves out of this meaning crisis. So for me, it's all points to the fact that we need a savior, you know, and actually that's why I think there is room for this Christian story to make a comeback, because actually I think people almost, like you said, it's almost like a last resort thing. I was so depressed I tried praying, you know, or went to church. And yeah, maybe that's the point you have to get to until people realize I can't do this in my own strength. So I might just go back to the idea that there's someone out there who can help me, you know.
It is a beautiful idea that we have something that we can hold up and say, look, we have the script for this. It's already here. You know, you look at that New Testament Jesus Christ and you say, in that and through his sacrifice, you have everything and more. You know, he says he can take our burdens from us and make them light. What bigger burden is there today than those burdens of anxiety, depression, a struggle for meaning? And I mean, even with the ideological symptoms that you mentioned, I sometimes think the only way to solve those is to have an atonement, you know, a mediator in between, to say, I mean, who else is going to drop down, condescend, and allow that sort of mediation to take place other than Jesus Christ, who descended below all and died for us all, you know, and took that upon him. It's incredible, really, that we have that, and
that it is God in Jesus Christ. You know, I think that's absolutely key. That the God who created you came down to your level, and in fact went way below your level. You know, as Paul says in the Philippians Christ hymn, was obedient to death, even to death on a cross. You know, the most shameful way you could possibly die in that culture was what he willingly chose, God willingly chose. And that is just the most incredible story. I mean, I say incredible, I don't mean that in the sense of it's literally unbelievable. I just mean it's amazing. And the thing is, it is believable, or people are starting to find it believable again, because that sort of invests an individual with the kind of value and purpose and identity that you could never get from any other sort of social, political ideology. It's you know, it's literally God gave himself for you. That for me is like, it's the best story that's ever been told, and it always will be. Not just because it's really helpful, it's because it's true. And for me, that's sometimes the missing piece of the Jordan Petersons and co. is that actually this is actually not just a useful fiction that's helped our culture to thrive in the past, but it's only thrived and worked because it is in fact true in that sense.
What do you think of when, I don't know if you saw it, but Alex O'Connor, who we both know, had Richard Dawkins on his podcast, and Alex asked about Jordan Peterson, and I think Richard said something to the sense of he impresses by using words that no one can understand, and compared him to Deepak Chopra.
Yeah, I think he said he thinks his talk about God is BS, basically. And,
yes, he did.
I get that, and to be honest, there are sometimes bits of Jordan Peterson when I read it, I think, what exactly are you actually saying here? Modern. You know, he can tend to perhaps one of his failings is he goes off in a slightly too loquacious a direction, or tries to express things in ways. It's one of the failings of Russell Brand as well. He tends to use 10 words where one will do. But I think obviously, you know, Dawkins is just approaches life in a very different way to Peterson. So Dawkins is your classic modern scientist, rationalist, you know, and everything basically boils down to whether you can prove something at some scientific level. I think he is the definition of, you know, a scientistic kind of approach to life. And Peterson obviously just sees life in a much wider dimension than that. Imagination, mythology, symbolism, pattern, you know, there's this kind of whole other dimension to life that goes beyond the purely physical and biological that he's interested in. So it's inevitable that Dawkins is going to think he's talking rubbish, you know, because a lot of the time I feel like they're just talking at complete cross purposes. And there are some things they can kind of agree on, you know, they're both sort of got their concerns over the direction of woke ideology and all that kind of thing. But I think the reason they worry about it are slightly different. Dawkins is concerned about sort of scientific truth being sacrificed on the altar of political correctness or whatever. Jordan Peterson is worried about people's souls being corrupted. Basically, he really thinks, I think, at that kind of level about it. It's truth is more than just about making sure you get X and Y genes correctly labeled on people. It's about something much deeper for Jordan Peterson. I think it's a kind of, there's a spiritual dimension, if you like, to truth telling, and that's, I think, is the difference between Peterson and Dawkins.
Mm-hmm. With these figureheads, I mean, you and I know all of these people quite well, being in the sort of podcast space. I wonder, what do you think the role of new sort of decentralized media has been in the rebirth of belief in God?
I think at one level it's been fantastic because it does allow so many more perspectives to come out, and that's one of the wonderful things about the world of podcasts and everywhere is I benefited from that in the 17 and a half years I was hosting the Unbelievable show, where I could have the kinds of conversations with people people couldn't get on the BBC or the mainstream channels, which had once been the only place people could really access that kind of material. So it's been an amazing democratization and everything else. It's obviously got its dangers as well, because with so much content, with it becoming ever more niche, people can get sucked down, rabbit holes that lead them to some sometimes very dangerous places, especially when the algorithms are essentially set up to kind of feed you more and more of the kind of stuff that's lighting up your brain. And we know, we're aware of all the research that shows how people can become radicalized in various ways because of that, either on the left or on the right. They can be religiously radicalized. ISIS, have been able to recruit young people because they were able to hook them into, some particular media streams. Other ideologies have been able to essentially, capture young people's minds in that way. So there's obviously huge dangers as well. So yeah, that's where we are, aren't we? And I think overall, I'm glad of the internet revolution and the communication revolution it's brought us, but it doesn't sort of mean that I don't know, it's like we're living in an internet age, but with Stone Age minds still, as they say, and we're very bad at actually being able to see through all of the stuff that's there trying to influence us and pull us in various directions. We still kind of, that lizard part of our brain still tends to respond to the clickbait, outrage, stuff that people are so good at kind of capturing our attention with. So I think it's more important than ever in the media age we live in. I suppose this is where I'm landing too. For me, for the Christian story and Christian habits, which involve actually being discerning and, not simply being wedded to your appetites and, being blown this way and that by whatever is in front of you on your screen. It's that Christian discipline of pursuing truth, and the fruits of the Spirit, love, peace, gentleness, self-control, and everything else that are more important than ever in an age where essentially we're kind of increasingly being manipulated, I think, by tech, AI, algorithms, and everything else. Because there was a kind of honeymoon period where it felt like we were genuinely experiencing a kind of a new freedom in the ability to kind of listen to whoever you want to, watch whoever you want to on podcasts and so on. But I think that quickly gave way to Google and Facebook and everyone else essentially, being able to monetize you and being able to kind of, radically influence large swathes of people by simply controlling the kind of thing they were next suggested to click on, basically. So that's the big danger, isn't it? That we have to be ever more mindful of what we're being called to, especially if you call yourself a Christian in an age where you can be so easily swayed in today's culture.
And continuing that, actually, I read a lot of surveys, as you can tell, and studies, try to keep my ear to the ground. And one that really interested me, I think it was towards the end of 2023 it came out, but it showed that young people, when they were taking a survey about media, they were asked about their view of explicit scenes in films, and overwhelmingly, and to the shock of the surveyors, they were saying, no, we actually really aren't comfortable with explicit scenes in films. We don't want them. We would much rather have a proper, traditional, uplifting romance story. And that, you've worked with Louise Perry and have a great podcast with her. And is that a big symptom of this rebirth, this sort of a return to traditional sort of prudishness, thinking about marriage more?
I think that we might just be starting to see the signs of that. It's interesting. I have a teenage daughter. She's on Instagram, and she's a Christian, so she kind of follows a number of Christian influencers, and that will inevitably influence her feed. But I do notice a kind of, among certain influences, a sort of return to a kind of, a sort of conservative traditional ethic in various respects, and not just appealing to those who you might expect to already be kind of signed up for that, but actually even among, secular teenage girls, a sort of sense of, it's almost the new rebellion in a weird way, because we live in such a over-sexualized culture that is so, where kind of, Nicki Minaj and all that, it's just sort of on your screens and in your timeline and everything all the time if you're a young person. I think there's a weird way in which kind of a reaction against that is the new sort of rebellious. It's saying I'm going to do something different to it. Now I don't know. That might be just a small number that realistically is appealing to, but there is something about that. And Louise Perry, who you mentioned, I think is a good example of this, as someone who simply has been pointing out the ways in which the sexual revolution has actually been bad for women, and kind of through writing that book that she wrote, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, and the podcast she hosts, has suddenly had this flood of, responses, especially from young women, saying, you've said what I was feeling for so long. And all she was doing was giving them permission to not basically buy into the sexual norms of our current culture, which is, that you're expected to have sex with people, soon after meeting them, basically. And it's so interesting, isn't it, that all a lot of young women need to hear is permission that you don't have to buy into this. You don't have to abide by the sexual norms of your peers, because actually it turns out they're far more in the favor of men than in women. And so I just wonder, I do think there's something swinging back in that direction. I think there's a kind of a pushback against the over-sexualized, hyper-pornified kind of culture that we're currently swimming in, especially our young people. And, I think it's probably in the end going to be young people themselves who realize, I'm not happy, the Hollywood ideal is not coming true in my life. And good for them. I hope that they'll, I hope Hollywood hasn't done too much damage to them in the process, but I hope that they will see that this, supposedly fuddy-duddy Christian ethic of monogamous marriage and chastity probably has more going for it than they realized. And I do think, more and more people are actually waking up to that now.
Mm-hmm. We've got Professor Brad Wilcox from International Family Studies too, bringing his new book out and talking a lot about marriage. So it'll be really interesting to see where that goes too. He actually did a study the other day about how fewer divorces are happening, and but they're not instigated by men. But I think that's also because less marriages are happening, which hopefully we'll see a differing trend in that. But I think Nick Cave said at Unheard, if you wanted to be a rebel back in the 90s or the 70s, you dyed your hair and you swore, you got earrings, and now if you want to be a rebel, you you just suit up and go to church, which is a great quote. I wonder, do you feel hopeful about faith specifically in the UK? I mean, sometimes I wonder if we're at a point of no return when I see the stats, the quite discouraging stats about the UK being one of the most secular places in the world.
I think if I were to just base it on the stats, I would feel hopeless because it does look like it's just a downward trajectory in that sense. But of course, I don't believe the stats tell you everything. And in a way, as I say, again, my evidence is more anecdotal than statistical when it comes to this surprising rebirth of belief in God. Because I think if we're anywhere, we're just at the very beginning of the turning of the tide. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, I'm also a Christian, and I have a faith that the God who has, brought his purposes to fulfillment through Jesus will do so, until he returns. And there's a sense in which the church at various points through history has died various deaths, has not been up to the task, and God has had to renew and reform the church at various points. And to that extent, I think, that there's nothing new in that. And we happen to be at this very moment. And let's remember this is a phenomenon that is specifically located in Western culture. Across the rest of the world, Christianity is growing as fast as it has ever grown. So let's not, imagine that this is anything but actually at this moment an interesting Western phenomenon where people have decided they don't believe in God. It is, and to that extent, I think, as I say, I think history goes in these tides, and it's completely possible that we are due to have another kind of revival in the West. There have been plenty of those in the past. I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said something along the lines of, the Christian church has experienced many deaths, but it has always been reborn because it has a God who knew his way out of the tomb. And I think that's just the nature of things. So as a Christian, I am not at all hopeless about the situation, because I really do believe God is in control ultimately, and God's purposes will be fulfilled. I'm not saying that means that there's going to be some wonderful turnaround in the next 2 years here in the UK or anything like that. I don't know. I'm not a good prophet of what exactly the future holds in the immediate sense. I've just got a sure and certain hope that actually God's not finished with the church in the bigger picture, because he's always been faithful in the past.
Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that the UK will humble itself to a point where we may not need a calamity to be the catalyst for change. I mean, we have so many rumors of war and terrible things like conscription going on that it's like, is this what it's going to take to...
Yeah, I've had similar thoughts myself, and it's interesting, isn't it, that in fact, and sadly, it has often been those kind of momentous, tumultuous world events that have brought people back to faith. And so the last time there was a sort of bump in religiosity in the West was after the Second World War. And I think 2 world wars brought home to people the how precious life is, how now pray God that it doesn't take something like that to turn people back to God. But who knows what the future could hold. And I think it's funny when the Ukraine war began, a couple of years ago, I think it was a shock to lots of people, because this was the first time in 75 years that there had been war in continental Europe. And that was so, it was almost like we'd been lulled for a couple of generations into thinking, well, we've got this sorted, and we're reminded, we are fragile, we're human, we absolutely mess up, and we go down this route time and time and time again. But sometimes it's almost like it feels like, well, that's sometimes what is the catalyst, that reminder of our finitude and our brokenness. Just while we've been talking, I was looking up, forgive me, on something that someone tweeted at me recently with your with that kind of question mark about, is it all going downhill in terms of the statistics? There is this fascinating recent survey. This is from an article by Evangelical Focus, which shows that in Finland, an exceptional rise in religiosity has been observed, especially among young men. This is evident, for example, in the participation of 15 to 29-year-old men, so this is Gen Z, in church services. In 2011, only 5% of men attended church monthly, while in 2019, that figure rose to 12% in that age group. So there's just, I mean, and that could be just a random, sort of blip in, but Finland is one of those classic, secularized post-Christian countries. And yet you see something like that and that just goes, what on earth is going on there? Why? So there's little hints, I think, that something's stirring, that it's not all going to go in the direction that so many people are predicting,
Mm-hmm. And that's positive and hopeful. And you're right. As a Christian, if I'm not hopeful, then I'm not really a Christian. I need to remember that and remember that virtue. And, I think there will be a lot of challenges for faith coming in the future. I've been pondering on the consequences of an AI created by secular people, an AI that doesn't really comprehend or having anything to do with religion, what kind of impact that might have in the future. And, thinking of that sort of increased globalized world that we constantly step into and what challenges there might be for faith. But, you listen to your podcast and read your book and listen to you on Instagram, I religiously watch your reels, and you do get that sense of, there have always been challenges. There have always been things that come up, like new atheism, for example. But we rebirth again. The church rebirths. Am I saying that correctly? And so there is.
I know exactly what you mean, though. I think we very often got tunnel vision, and we only see our own situation and think this is the end result of civilization or something. We're one step along the way, and God's purposes and plans are much, much bigger than us. And all we can do is be faithful, holding on as best we can at times when it seems like everything's going downhill, and knowing that in God's bigger story, there were always going to be these peaks and troughs in the story, but ultimately we know the way it ends, and that's the faith we hold on to.
Mm-hmm. And they did a survey of the Boston Marathon bombings, of the stress levels and residual trauma of those that were actually there versus those that watched 90 minutes of news coverage about it. And it was increasingly higher stress and trauma from those who would watch the news about it. So there's a lesson to us all. Consume Justin's content and you won't have that worry. But no, I appreciate you, Justin, and I appreciate you coming on the show today. And what's next for you, and how can people keep up to date with what you're doing?
Thank you. Well, you've already mentioned the book. So if folk want to get hold of that, it's The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. There are signed copies available via my website if you want to get hold of it perhaps for someone else as well. justinbrierley.com. That's also where you can find the new podcast you've been mentioning, and that's very much a kind of deep dive into the themes of the book, documentary style podcast. And I've been thrilled to see how many people have been picking that up and downloading it since we launched a couple of months ago. I continue to produce contribute to a number of other podcasts. I'm in a new sort of transition period. In April last year, I moved on from hosting The Unbelievable Show after 17 and a half years to more of a freelance ministry but continuing in the area of cultural apologetics. So it's a big adventure. There's lots of plans afoot for more video content and other things, but an easy way to keep up with all of it is to sign up to my newsletter. Again, that's at justinbrierley.com. Not sure when this will be going out, Ben, but we've also got an exciting event coming up soon. 5th of March, I'm going to be in conversation with Tom Holland, the historian, in London, and that's kind of a special event linked with the book. So all of the the details are available again via the newsletter at justinbrierley.com.
Oh, fantastic. Well, this will be up before then, so I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. But yeah, thank you, Justin, and have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching For All the Saints. This show needs your help to grow. Please like the video, comment your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone you think would enjoy it. Thank you.